Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Percent, written by Allegoric. The price of Tanster had shot up after the news became public that the mines on the moons of Garena were nearly played out. A slow disaster, the first major economic fall in centuries. Sarjitu dealers and brokers began to hoard the precious mineral. Most modern drive systems relied on the rare natural crystals within it, and inevitably the financial ripples spread out. Drive maintenance and construction prices increased exponentially. Haulage rates, too. Commodity prices went up all across the outer worlds. Income did not. Businesses closed. Employment was hard to come by, and basics like food and replacement atmospheric gases became scarce. An interstellar slump. Hard times. The trading room had it really bad. The reports were hard to watch, like a throwback to a past age. Smuggled footage of starving, desperate, rag-clad Sarjitu miners mobbing store towers of hollow-eyed younglings gasping for air as they cut down the oxygen percentage by another point. There were other sources of Tanster, of course. It wasn't like the drives were going to stop working or anything, but the quantity of ore was lower, and the reserves were difficult to exploit. Prices were going to stay high. Not that the humans were affected, of course, they weren't. Their chunky, rugged ships used different tech foundations, inertial fields and Haldane coils and warp inducers. Ugly and a little slower, maybe, but solid and reliable. Their vessels had always been politely ignored by the other races, who preferred the elegant Sarjitu designs. But now, what with the building difficulties, they were in demand. Human shipyards were inundated, their books overflowing with orders for replacement drive units and even new ships. And that news coincided with the loss of the Selkath Ma, the big Jithmetsu Corporation transport that famously vanished out of beyond the Matek Nebula, never emerging from hyper, taking with it a half-year's worth of refined minerals and rare earths scratched from the harsh Sarjitu worlds out along the rim, knocked the stuffing out of their electronic manufacturers, weapons makers, and all the other industries that had been relying on her precious cargo. Humans had their own sources, stocks in abundance, in the way that humans always do, and the Sarjitu had no choice but to purchase from their neighbors' volatile, overpriced markets, near bankrupted them. And then, just to put a cherry on the top of what was already a bad situation, the old Pistaru San upped and died. The whole Sarjitu state went into mourning, shut down for weeks until eventually the new Pistaru assumed office. It wreaked havoc on the itineraries and schedules, near caused the second financial collapse on its own. The old boy had always been a pain, hard to deal with and keen on gifts to make a scheme happen. But he always found compromises and seen to it that his minions and staff engineered workarounds. He made things happen. The new fella was a stickler, it seemed, a traditionalist, keen to implement the old values, whatever they were. Focus on securing his position and embracing his loyalists in key roles on all the Sarjitu worlds. There was a great deal of disruption, of jockeying and petty politics. It affected a lot of things, caused a lot more problems with commerce as old officials disappeared and new officials took their places, bringing with them their new interpretations of old agreements. And just when the compromise had been found, they too were gone, and a new face had a new agenda appeared. The other species quickly found that the humans were just, well, easier. They might have been scheming hagglers who would cheerfully swindle you out of every last credit you possessed, if they got half the chance. But you could get past that. If you stuck to your guns and didn't let them baffle you with their slick words and awe you with their unbeatable deals, at least you knew where you were with a human. Their contracts were honored and their products were actually rather good for the price. It truly was a difficult time for the Sarjitu. Their dominance, their economy, the very stability of the polity seemed to be at real risk. But not so for the humans, and not by their own design either. It was something of a boon, and it just sort of fell into their laps. They were already an emerging technological and industrial powerhouse within the Alliance, just a step behind the ancient Sarjitu state, designing and improving and building as they quietly spread to new systems. The downturn in the fortunes of the Sarjitu only served to elevate them further. The Sarjitu generally seemed to hold no grudge over it, no anger, no hard feelings, though they had every reason to. It was a cycle, they said stoically, a fluctuation. In due time, things would be resolved, and their fortunes would be restored. The attack speeders came in low and fast, really fast, screaming across the sturdy sea. No emission plants, heavy drive shielding, nap of Earth flight. They almost made it under the sensor net without detection. Secondary detectors picked them up, luck really. A formation flew right over one of the mobile outposts and frantic alerts were sent. Interceptor squadrons were scrambled, accelerating out of their launch bays and soaring into the darkening evening skies. They had found them a few hundred clicks out, and a frantic dogfight ensued. The white Sargento craft jinking and weaving, skimming across the terrain at suicidal altitudes. The sleek human fighters twisting and rolling to get clean shots. Defensive fire from the alien craft, blue-white and rapid. Autocannon fire, orange-red traces searing the sky. Intense shrieks as missiles flew, and flashes and thuds and bangs as craft exploded and shattered across the hard ground. Bright trails crisscrossed the dark heavens. They got through. They were too fast, and there were too many, and they launched their payloads, chunky cruise missiles that sped and wove away. Old Port's defense batteries opened up, and the air was thick with projectiles, sweeping arcs of fire controlled by sophisticated sensors that locked onto the incoming blips and blew them out of the air. But again, there were just too many. The missiles found their targets, slamming into the towers and complexes with huge ground-shaking explosions. Many of the missiles were following one another, locked onto the same spot, their devastating impacts toppling already weakened structures or further fragmenting piles of rubble. The interceptors didn't let up as the speeders turned and streaked away. They swooped in, lean and menacing and hungry for vengeance, tearing through the retreating craft. Wreckage littered the boulder-strewn shoals, and columns of oily black smoke rose into the night. Those few speeders that escaped did so only because the interceptors had run out of ammo. The chyron below the news anchor carried with a grim total. Every few minutes it would clear and return with a new higher figure. Hundreds of thousands of missiles, tens of thousands confirmed dead. The human settlements on Meritus were in a mutual state of shock. The feed cut to the shot of a drone hovering over shattered rubble, the remnants of a huge apartment complex. Decent quality worker housing. It had been quite nice, with gardens, pools, on-site parking, a mall, a gymnasium even. The Sargento had leveled it. The drone panned out and rotated, showing the devastation as far as the camera could see, and the pall of smoke that hung over the city. Late evening. Lots of people had been home when the attack struck. The feed cut back to the frowning, grim-faced anchor. A graphic appeared beside her showing Outport and its surroundings. It marked the impact sites, dots in red, 80, they believed, hitting all over the city. Then came dots in blue, the fishing port and the marina, untouched, the big military base in the central point, and the maglev terminals, too, all intact. The only damage to the sprawling factories and the warehousing districts was from missiles that had been shot down. The city spaceport had been overflown during the attack, but was unharmed. All of the strikes had launched in residential districts. The footage switched to rescue crews clawing at rubble, and bloodied and dust-caked victims being carried away in impromptu stretchers, shocked, blank-faced survivors draped in reflective blankets and weeping, frantic friends and relatives clutching helplessly at their communications. The Terran intermediary demanded an audience with the ambassador. The official, a minor bureaucrat at the diplomatic enclave, signaled in the negative. "We cannot," they replied flatly. "I don't understand why," the intermediary insisted. "Humans and Sargento have always been best friends. Why would you do this? Why would you start a war?" The official fluttered his wings. Misunderstanding, confusion maybe, perhaps on a personal level. The signals were hard to interpret. "It is Sargento," it announced. It paused for a moment, as though checking something out of a shot, then shifted its attention back to the screen. 0.93, it said. It cut the link. There was openly talk of new trade negotiations amongst the Sargento delegations. The deteriorating economic situation demanded it. An agreement would be reached, and the humans would supply them with better-priced materials. Wealth and prosperity would be restored. You could hear the optimism, their anticipation. They saw technology exchanges and cultural programs and other such nonsense, too. Real proposals to the Terrans, serious expectations that specifications about drives and power plants and environmental tolerances would be handed over. That children of each species would frolic in meadows together, singing sentimental songs of others' home worlds. Madness. The human guards frowned in disgust and gripped their weapons tighter as the slender aliens nonchalantly ambled past in bead-festooned groups, chattering and touching one another as they made their way to the Senate Hall. They even hailed and waved politely. They didn't seem to have a care in the world. The human representatives were furious. Every question, every plea for reason was airily swept aside, as though it was of no consequence. "It is Sa-Jatu," said the speakers of the other species wisely, as if that somehow explained it. They variously gestured expressions of sympathy for the humans. They didn't know each other. They became painfully obvious. They'd all asked the Sa-Jatu, and they'd all got the same answer. "It is Sa-Jatu." They were tense, though. Their physiologies all had giveaways, little nervous tics, and of late they were noticeably more cautious around the Sa-Jatu. They didn't understand this warlike behavior on any better than the humans did, and they were clearly glad the same wasn't happening to them. It was not something that they had experienced before. None of the other species shared a world with the Sa-Jatu, though, save, of course, for a few compounds that housed their diplomatic staff. None of them really shared their worlds at all, or had the human habit of emplacing themselves in mass on worlds already settled by others. It didn't mean that they didn't get along, that they weren't good neighbors. It was just that none of the other species had the compunction to integrate and coexist in the strange, impractical, gregarious way that humans did, except for the Sa-Jatu. It was ironic that they had been the most welcoming, the most accepting, and the most open. Still cautious, though, only willing to take baby steps. But that was far more than any of the others. They even counted in Base 10, made everything so much simpler. They had granted lands to the settlers on the jewel that was Merelis, our whole continent, and a nice one at that, temperate and fertile. The world orbited a calm yellow star and had conditions ideal for both species. Though their settlements were separate, on different land masses, they shared and traded comfortably with one another, and had done so now for generations. And Merelis wasn't some backwater either. It was a vital link on the freight routes that wound down from the outer rim, a hub of trade, a hive of industry, with good yards and good facilities, a place both Sa-Jatu and human were proud to call home. Only Merelis, though, so far. There had been talk of new human settlements further in, within the Heart Worlds. Negotiations had been quite advanced before the old Pistaru turned up his toes and went to meet his ancestors. That was then, though. Now, the human Senate officers were a maelstrom of activity, of calls and messages back and forth to try and discover what was happening. The settlement plans long since cast aside and forgotten. Experts peered at maps and dissected reports and tried to find answers. Humorless, somber-faced mandarins in sharp suits held hushed discussions with burly-uniformed officers whose chests were thick with ribbons. Assistants and secretaries rushed here and there with data pads and documents and fresh cups of coffee. At least the conflict was restricted to Merelis and showed no signs of spreading. Indeed, beyond that world, everything seemed to be as normal as it was within the Sa-Jatu polity. The economic difficulties it was experienced muddied the waters, but there was no marked changes to industrial activities, no explained movements of personnel or equipment, no indications of a greater military build-up. Things were happening, of course, things that were not well understood. Some populations had been displaced and new leaders and officials had been instated, but that was to be expected until the new Pistaru and his regime were firmly entrenched. Diplomatic efforts were stepped up and ships and agents were dispatched to gather as much intelligence as was possible. Long Beach and Culver were quiet sprawls, affluent suburbs of the city of marshland, really, full of elegant high-rises, spacious malls, and tidy habitats with carefully tended lawns and ocean views. The flat-bottomed landing craft deposited the heavy guns and their crews at intervals along the narrow windswept island that lay off the main shore, then chunked off back to their tenders to collect their next load. The Sa-Jatu dug the artillery in, neatly stacked the ammunition canisters and stocks of supplies, and carefully confirmed their ranging. They waited. The officers watched their chronometers, and the troops checked over everything again and again. At the designated time, just as the yellow star dipped below the horizon, they let the barrage fly, great rippling volleys of fire that lit up the sky. Heavy shells, filled with high explosives or incendiary submunitions, rained down onto the quiet towns. As soon as the outer loaders were empty and the new packs were hefted into place, and firing resumed. The detonating shells lifted and flattened structures and tore great gouges into the ground, their blasts tracing methodical patterns across the grids of streets as they exploded. Gouts of earth and debris were thrown high into the air. Buildings shattered, and apartment blocks and houses blew out or collapsed. People huddled and hid and cried, or ran here and there, seeking shelter anywhere they could. The storm of fire was relentless, coldly efficient, and brutal, cutting its victims down. The landing craft passed below the barrage and ground up onto the rocky mainland shore. Their forward ramps dropped, and vehicles, armored, wheeled turret things, bristling with guns, roared up the shallow shingle beaches, over the scrubby tough grass dunes, and onto the long coastal highway. They assembled, and at their arranged moment the artillery fire stopped and swept off. They stalked through the towns in loose, slow, growling groups, their articulated suspensions carrying them over the wreckage and craters, their guns mowing down anyone they saw, and riddling houses and homes with rounds. The vehicles chose targets and let loose jets of chemical flame from their turrets, dousing the shell-shattered ruins and turning them into infernos. The survivors fled to conflagrations, and the Sargetu blasted them down, driving over the injured as they chose a new spot to set aflame. Although the folks that lived there were easily heavily armed as any, a rifle that would drop a clash at 50 paces was little use against a tank. They tried, though, in little parcels of resistance, lobbing bottles of burning volatiles that smashed against the armored plates and sent sheets of flame over them, and even ramming one of the Sargetu invaders with a truck, spinning the tank around before it was able to back away and immolate and riddle its erstwhile attackers. They retreated back to their landing craft when the bloody work was done. The artillery spirited away, too, and they withdrew to the fastness of the ocean, not trying to occupy the territory they had devastated. The grave-faced Terran intermediary demanded an audience. Sargetu, bureaucrat, in no hurry at all, eventually took the call.
"This is an atrocity, an outrage,"
said the human, fighting to keep his composure.
"We have no choice but to retaliate."
"It is Sargetu." The bureaucrat flicked an antenna in a way that indicated annoyance or hunger. The gestures were similar.
"Why?"
said the intermediary.
"Why are you doing this?"
It seemed distracted for a moment, then briefly signaled understanding. 1.27, it replied. It cut the link. It had been decided. No weapons of mass destruction, no orbital bombardments, equivalence, retaliation, escalate only if they did. Coordinated strikes in force that would negate the Sargetu capacity to attack. The planning was as meticulous as it was fast. The great port cities of Ran Atha and Surakul, commercial centers and major hubs on the northern tip of the sprawling Southland, were the prime targets. Exquisite reconnaissance gleaned from satellites, imageries, and agents on the ground, and even from the myriad of tourism apps and image galleries that were available on the networks, provided a long list of targets. Analytical computers composited data, providing their output on holodisplays that pinpointed defensive positions and highlighted weak points. Coordinators and planners oversaw preparations and gathered supplies. Routes were plotted, and approvals were given and authorized by the highest officials. Contingencies were considered and accounted for. Units were made ready, and finally 0 hour came. It was laughably easy. Nothing to start with. Clear skies like there wasn't a war on. The first weapons flashed in. Secretive Sargetu sites, control centers, and sensor farms were hit by hardened devices that piled them deep into the ground, detonating with brutal force and erupting in enormous plumes of dirt and rock, tearing apart subterranean complexes and surface structures alike. Their defenses were blinded, deafened. Their flak began, desultory and sporadic at first, but increasing in intensity until it seemed every one of the myriad spires and globes of the metropolis were throwing up sweeping arcs of yellow and white that lit up the skies. It was spectacular, but it was poorly placed at best, concentrated around huge hives of sprawling warren mounds, far from the chosen targets. So the humans left them to their light show, if it kept them occupied. Waves of missiles streaked in across the waters, unopposed, no counterfire of any kind. Each lined up their attacks and ran and slammed into their targets in an inferno of destruction. Facilities were leveled, automated factories smashed. The ports were savaged. Domed sheds and long crescent halls were blasted away. Heavy, organic-looking cranes and cargo lifters severed from their mountings and thrown into mangled heaps. Dozens of the huge catamaran freighters left sinking or burning at their moorings in their harbors. The endless rows of storage compounds were cratered, with stacks of cargo pods smashed and scattered, and their contents ablaze. Maglev routes across the region were cut and junctions broken. Maintenance plants demolished, power grids torn apart, camo relays flattened. Every strike, every blow, pinpoint accurate, maximum damage, maximum effect, minimal casualties, surgical. They left the spaceport alone, though, just as the Sargetu had left theirs. No need to set a precedent. The Sargetu Air Force rose to meet them, their stubby fighters rocketing up out of their silos. The massed human interceptors had been circling out over the waters, waiting for the moment, and they pounced. The fighters put up a damned hard fight. expertly weaving and spiraling, using every tactic they knew and every advantage they possessed. The human intelligence regarding their numbers and types had been more than good, and they were horribly outclassed and hideously outnumbered. It was hopeless. They never stood a chance. In a desperate spiral of maneuvers and turns, they were torn into pieces by blasts of autocannon fire, exploding into greasy orange fireballs, or plunging downwards amid flames and trails of dark smoke and debris, as one sleek interceptor after another got into a good position and let loose, eager to be the one to claim the kill. They were swept from the skies, their burning wreckage littered the ground. A special vengeance was reserved for military bases and the naval facilities. Wave after wave of attacks went in, flattening launch silos and facilities and barracks and sheds. Anything that rolled or flew or floated was a prime target, and the humans fired everything they had. When the missiles were done, the pilots disregarded orders and took their craft in, emptying their guns and pods into anything that was left, and even leaning out of the cockpit windows, blasting away with their pistols. "For Long Beach!" they yelled, and spat on the scorched and melted remains. Then they mined the naval facilities, specialist craft flying low over the shattered boats, and landing craft in the harbors, and sowing the areas thickly with their devices. It was like training, like the simulator set on easy. The facilities, all of them, were rendered unusable. The humans had hit them hard. The Sergeant or Ambassador was furious, livid in, "Why would you do this? Such barbarity, such terrible harm." The human representatives were speechless. "Are we not just your sisters, your brothers, your kin?" it raged. "Do we not live as one, in togetherness? Do we not breathe the same air? Oh, how we have misjudged you! Such cruelty! You have killed hundreds of thousands. Your actions are unacceptable. They belittle you, reduce you, they shame you." The ambassador stormed, spreading its jewel-woven wings and shouting over the voice of the human, "Compensation is required immediately and in full, so as to replace the losses you have wrought on to put the right wrong." It blinked its giant eyes, then seemed to gather itself. It folded its wings back and then lowered its head. It paused and breathed deeply. 1.27, it said. "That is how it stands." It cut the link. It was being serious. 3.59 trillion credits in the form of material and components and strategic commodities to be provided to the Sarjatu as compensation for the heinous acts, the war crimes that the humans had committed. Everything itemized, laid out in black and white, everything accounted for. The demand was presented to the Senate, neatly drafted and in the correct languages and legally binding. To ignore it would be to undermine the whole foundation of Alliance law. No matter how pompous, no matter how hypocritical it might be, they had to hear it at least, even if the humans had no intention at all of agreeing to their demands. Day 3, over 7,000 devices proclaimed the Chiron. It was laid over shaky footage of incoming rockets or missiles or whatever you wanted to call them soaring overhead, the sky dark with them it seemed. One, lower than the others, was clearly visible as it sped by, a bulbous-nosed cylinder festooned with curved wings, and with a hot blue exhaust at the rear, twice the length of a man and a pale grey color that made it hard to see against the sky. The grim-faced anchor appeared with a map showing the whole northern seaboard and the swath of impact sites concentrated on and around the cities. The view cut to defense batteries, silhouetted against red evening clouds, angled upwards and firing sporadic blasts of bright white into the darkening skies. Every now and again, a yellow flash followed by a distant bang showed that they had found their targets. Then cockpit camera views of craft sweeping down onto the launch sites, of neatly lined up Sarjatu launch vehicles, no attempt at concealment. Fresh missiles stacked nearby, their crews scattered as they became aware of the approaching threat. Munitions straddled them, and bright explosions engulfed them and tore them apart. The anchor paused her monologue while the footage played. Another map came up, and she began again. Coastal regions had been evacuated following the Long Beach incident, and heavily equipped troops patrolled all the way from the impenetrable forests of the Scarabar Peninsula to the white sands of the Iborgi, she explained. If another raid was tried, it would be met by considerable force. Images of equipment festooned soldiers scanning the horizon were followed by footage of those same soldiers taking optimistic potshots at rockets that happened to be passing overhead. Advertising played, filled with virility, trite products being offered for sale, then cut back to the channel theme and logo, and then to the anchor. "Coming up," she said, "we have expert analysis. Why do the missiles only explode over inhabited zones?" Dramatic music surged and swirled in the background, and a graphic spun in a corner. "The war. Where do we strike next? But first this." Scenes of a scruffy but cheerful children appeared, sitting within a tiled tunnel and eagerly slurping up cups of broth. Casualties had been mercifully light. The voiceover from the anchor continued. The worst loss of life is Mar Severano, where the family later to evacuate was caught in a blast. Footage showed people crowded together in stark grey chambers, sleeping in rows or sitting in circles and praying and singing, kids playing on their consoles beside heavy blast dolls, and toddlers clutching oversized plush dolls while cooing happily on utilitarian bunks. Chyrons gave the names of the towns as their images rolled. Almost the whole of the population were in shelters or public bunkers, and a guest pundit estimated deep underground where they were safe from the falling ordnance. Its annoyance was so palpable that Sergeant Ambassador almost smacked its white desktop. "You still show such a lack of foresight, such ignorance," it raged. "Why would you do these things?" The human intermediary stared back. He glanced away angrily, its eyes focusing back and forth. Its antenna twitched in frustration. "That cannot be!" it exclaimed to an unseen being. It looked back to the screen. 1.27, it replied, hunching in a gesture of regret. "Still 1.27. They cut the link. Humans had a way of finding things out, of discovering, of uncovering the truth. Often they wished that they hadn't. Reports of genocide, the clearance across the great settlements of the Southland, began to filter in. A public already hardened by atrocities they had suffered were shocked. Mass killings, hundreds of bombings, apparently, followed by the execution squads that cut down survivors. It was unthinkable. The numbers were still provisional, but of the 30 million or so charged to on Meredith, the victims numbered far in excess of 1 million. So many, there were even reports of an appalling incident in Ron Atha. The slaughter appeared to have stopped, relatively abruptly, around a week ago. Yet there seemed to be few repercussions within Sargetu society on Meredith. No outrage, little acknowledgement even. The Sargetu, keeping themselves to themselves, as all the species did, said nothing. But they had done it. They committed the deed, and they'd been found out. The investigator kept digging, and what began to trickle of rumors and stories about the Southland turned into a flood. It wasn't just Meredith. It was systems all across the Outer Rim. Appalling images of Sargetu facilities on Locorus emerged, of workers disposing of heaped corpses, the wounds on their broken bodies obvious to see. The census lists from industrial Navin was obtained, with endless designations, names in the many other languages struck through, cold and impersonal, another statistic, another number, to be disposed of. There were more, there were worse. It seemed to be random, whole hives raised, Sargetu cut down without regard for age or gender or belief or wings spread, other hives untouched. Terror bombings that battened whole districts, armed squads with no declared allegiance and no markings, going systematically from level to level within warrants and executing any they found, then just melting away. No faction or group claimed responsibility. What monsters were they? The Sargetu representatives were confronted by the Senate, by humans and the other species too, appalled by what they had discovered, but they gave no explanation. They offered no apology. Every state pondered the new Pandaru with anxiety and suspicion. His work, surely. A tyrant, a demagogue, and monster in the making, ruthlessly cleansing his territories of all opposition. It would explain the disruption in their bureaucracy, the constant stream of new faces. No. Even a cursory look at the data showed that his allies, his trusted aides, his own clan even, had suffered as much as any. The massacres had hurt him equally. And not one individual from their world came forward to the Senate to ask for a sanctuary or protection, though it would have been easy enough to do so. No appeals were launched by grieving relatives, no complaints against the acts by the wronged. It was as though the dreadful crimes weren't happening, as if they didn't matter. "It is Sargetu," said the speaker dispassionately. But as it went on, the awful reports continued to accumulate. They saw the hint of a pattern begin to emerge. It was the easiest to spot on the rim where the populations were low. The little mining outpost of Banu, an intelligence brief showed, had 10,500 Sargetu staff and personnel, and independent reports all seemed to indicate around 450 deaths, then no further trouble. The agricultural settlement of Cormax, 220,000 Sargetu, casualties believed to be approximately 9,000, then no further trouble. Rommel, 38,000, around 1,500 reported victims, then no further trouble. The ambassador stared out of the window at the distant port facilities and the silvery crescent of the moons, still just visible in the sky. Merchantmen and freighters and liners and transports of all kinds were berthed. their hatches and doors open as crew struggled to organize the crowds that surged around them. A stream of shuttles ferried passengers up to yet more vessels in orbit, depositing their charges and then dropping back down for the next batch. Endless queues of evacuees clutching their most treasured possessions filed out from the terminal buildings onto their already full plascrete aprons. The majority were going to a big naval facility on Yana for the time being. It had the facilities to cope. Chances are, many of them would end up back in Meredith, slipping back to their homes once the whole mess had been sorted out and things had calmed down. How to define it? The species, the state, an invader, a frame of mind. Yes, of course. But no. Necessity, an act of charity, kindness even. Take away the need to make an unpleasant decision, doing something unpleasant so that someone else doesn't have to, making a tough choice on someone else's behalf. Being humane. It's difficult. None are wrong. They all described it in a way. None are quite right either. It's bigger. Terrible deeds done for the greater good. It's that too. And such things never sit well, no matter how we look at them. Uncomfortable echoes through history and all that. Murderer, so that we wouldn't have to murder each other. Remote acts by unseen assailants, you've never had to look them in the eye. Acts of misguided mercy. But leave all else intact, so that those who remain may prosper. For the greater good. The ambassador looked across to her intermediary. They say that we crave integration, that we follow some instinctive drive to bond, to be part of the group, she paused. Probably we do. The networks are full of fine stories about our pack bonding. They absolutely integrated us, took us in, made us a part of their own. Funny thing, though, we didn't notice. When they did what they felt they had to, but they have always done when times are hard, they naturally included us in it. No need to warn, no need to explain, no exemption. Just do what is necessary. We are them, well, on Marinus at least. Why that number, though? A scientifically derived benchmark, ancient tradition, some physiological or pheromonal trigger related to population density. No one was sure. Whatever the case, there were now resources to spare, and empty roles to be had throughout the outer room, no matter the wrongs of it. Sociologists and economists and biologists and historians and even deities knew who else would be agonizing and moralizing over it for years to come. She shook her head and took her seat, initiating the communication. The image of her Star-Digital counterpart appeared. "Ambassador," she said, choosing her words carefully, 520,000 are gone. She closed her eyes and hung her head for a moment. "The color's done. The flock has been thinned," she continued. "We offer our gracious thanks for your attempts to enact this difficult decision for us, to take us from a terrible burden of deciding who. We have done what was necessary in our own way." The alien paused for a moment, looking beyond the camera and signaling with its antenna. 4.03, he replied, looking back and spreading his wings in an expression of satisfaction. And the humans willingly paid for reparations. More even than they asked for, and provided raw materials and finished goods and all the other things that were needed to repair the infrastructure that they had so effectively demolished. They had it to spare. The factories of terror could churn out faster than they could install it. It made sense. With a little goodwill, and by keeping a weather eye on the fragile economy, they could quietly step in when necessary, manipulate prices or availability. They could avoid anything like this ever happening again. But there was a better reason, a more noble reason. Plain and simple. That's what you do for your sister, your brother, your kin. That was Sa-Jitu. End of story. Just quickly, I don't normally do this, but for this one I think I will. There was some confusion in the comments of the story about what actually happened in the story. So during tough times, the Sa-Jitu, they start killing their own, culling them so that the resources can go further and that the economy and world can be balanced. And they just included the humans because they considered them brothers and sisters. The humans didn't realize that this would happen because it had been so long since it had happened, because they had such a long economic growth period, so they hadn't had any hard times, so there was no record of what happens in bad times. So the Sa-Jitu were only doing what they were biologically programmed to do, and it wasn't malicious. I hope that makes sense in some way. Anyways, thank you for watching. Have a good one. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholt, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.